I would like to welcome all of you as president of Middle East Peace Now. This is our September 2020 forum. And we would also like to welcome our co-host, the Eastside Freedom Library, and I will introduce Peter in just a moment. Before we get started, there are some housekeeping items that I would like to go over to make sure that this forum goes smoothly via Zoom. Please submit your questions to Dr. Khalidi using the Q&A feature of Zoom, not the chat, but the Q&A feature. Maddie, who is our technical advisor and administrator for this, will be monitoring all of the questions. If you have issues with Zoom itself, please, with the Q&A feature, you can email Maddie at mepn@mepn.org. So just send a quick email. She's also monitoring our emails, and she'll handle issues that way too. We will be keeping everyone on mute, so there are no interruptions with Dr. Khalidi's forum. If you have a question about Zoom, please use the chat. So the questions for Dr. Khalidi go in the Q&A feature. Questions about Zoom itself, you can put those questions in chat. And again, Maddie will monitor those. We will enable closed captions, and this forum will be recorded or is being recorded for future viewing. So these are the housekeeping items. I don't think I've forgotten anything, have I, Maddie? Okay, at this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Peter Ratcliffe, who is co-founder and co-executive director of the Eastside Freedom Library. He's also a retired professor of history at Macalester College, and I'm sure Peter will tell you about the connection with Macalester and Dr. Khalidi. He will moderate our conversation with Dr. Khalidi, and Peter, I give you a warm welcome.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Maddie, for your work on this. And I also want to send a shout out to Mary Bader, who had the great idea of bringing the Eastside Freedom Library and Middle East Peace Now together on this project. I'm fortunate sitting here in the library. We're sort of open. We're asking people who want to come in and do research to reach out to us in advance, make an appointment, come in and use our resources, and observe the safety procedures that we've implemented. Our mission is to inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate for equity for all. We're now doing most of that work online. And we're discovering, as I think our friends at Middle East Peace Now are also discovering, that there are some good things about this difficult time that we're in terms of communications, that we're able to involve people like Dr. Khalidi in conversation without having them get on an airplane and stay in a hotel. And we're also able to involve broader communities in conversation. So we want to encourage you to keep track of what we're doing at the Eastside Freedom Library. Visit our website, visit our Facebook page, go to the Get Involved header on our website and make sure that you're receiving our twice-a-month electronic newsletter. So it's my really great pleasure to introduce Rashid Khalidi today. Our first connection was through his wonderful son, Sim, who was a student at Macalester 2 decades ago. And Sim has become a very significant playwright, artist, artist advocate and administrator, having quite an impact in the world. And it's really great. I'm sure that it's especially great for Rashid to see the wonderful accomplishments that Sim has been making. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University in New York City and co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. He's the author of 7 books. We're here to discuss his new book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017. Settler colonialism has been an important framing argument and perspective for a lot of the work that we've done here at the Freedom Library, connecting the experiences of Dakota people here in St. Paul with the experiences of Palestinians, the experiences of colonized people all over the world. So it's exciting to see how this new book uses that framework to give us, I think, new ways to think about the Palestinian situation. In this book, Dr. Khalidi draws on archival materials and the reports of generations of family members, judges, scholars, diplomats, library founders, and writers, including himself, who were present at key moments in the struggle for the land of Palestine that has lasted now more than a century. Accepted interpretations of the Palestine-Israel conflict often describe the struggle as a tragic clash between two peoples with claims to the same land. But Rashid demonstrates in this book that the war has always been colonial in nature, a war waged against the native population, first by the Zionist movement and then by the State of Israel, but backed first by the colonial imperialist power of Great Britain and then by the colonial imperialist power of the United States. From the Balfour Declaration in 1917 to the destruction of Palestine in 1948, from the War of 1967 to Israel's recent assaults on Gaza. This background is essential for an understanding of the struggle today, as the Israeli government talks of yet expanding territorial annexations, and Israel faces the choice of apartheid or a single binational state with equal rights for all. So Dr. Khalidi has some preliminary remarks he would like to make. Then I'm going to ask a very few questions, and then we're going to open up to questions from you who are watching through Zoom and through the Facebook page. So Rashid, would you like to go ahead, please?
Sure. Thank you so much, Peter, for that introduction. Thank you, Janet, Maya, Maddie, Mary Better, everybody who made this possible. The book's genesis is something I want to talk about, how I came to write this book and what kind of book it is. And I'll say a little bit more about some other aspects of it. Peter's actually touched on some of the things that I think are important about the book. I'll say a little more about some of them. The genesis of this book is quite different from everything I've ever written. I had written 7 books before I wrote this one. Edited a few volumes of essays. All of it was mainly in the academic vein. All of my output up to that point was essentially directed at other Middle East specialists, scholars, people interested in the Arab world, the Middle East, the great powers, imperialism and colonialism in the Middle East, Palestine, and so forth. And it was actually my son, Ismail, who studied with Peter at Macalester. We know him as Sim, Ismail. That was his name when he played baseball, because Ismail, people couldn't get their mouths around Ismail. So we called him at home, we called him Sim, and people came to call him Sim. He said to me, Pa, it's about time that you wrote something that, you know, people can find accessible and that's written for a general audience. Enough already with literature for specialists. You know, it's time to write something about Palestine that actually can find an audience of people who are not experts. And he urged me insistently. He can be very insistent. He urged me insistently down this path. And he and another cousin of mine very much helped me to frame this. And he also said, look, you were there for a variety of things that happened, the Israeli siege of Beirut, the negotiations in Madrid and Washington starting in 1991, other important events in the history of Palestine. You should put that stuff in to the book. Don't write it from the third person as you usually do, as academics do. Write it, you know, from a first-person perspective, and bring in things that relate to you or relate to people you knew or know. And so I wrote a very different book to anything I've ever written before, which, not just as Peter said, includes a lot of family history and personal histories of other people who I knew or whose autobiographies I used, but also my own experiences, things that I'd heard, things that my father told me, things that my aunts told me, and throughout the book, I draw on those kinds of personal accounts, either from other people or from their autobiographies or from my own personal experiences. And in this respect, the book is completely different than anything I've ever written. And I hope that helps to make it accessible and approachable to ordinary readers, people who are not, Middle East historians or specialists on Palestine. It's not meant for them. There are 45 pages of footnotes for those who, have that interest, but you don't need to read the footnotes. You just read the text, and it's meant to be approachable and accessible. So that's the first thing I want to say about the book. The second thing is something that Peter touched on, which is that this book attempts to shatter the false framing of the question of Palestine. The false framing of the question of Palestine either describes it entirely from an Israeli perspective. This is a story of liberation of the Jewish people. This is a post-Holocaust story. This is a story of redeeming the land. I could go on and on with the Zionist narrative, which essentially foregrounds Israel and which puts the Palestinians into, at best, a secondary position. In most cases, it puts them into an entirely negative situation. Because if this is about Israel and this is about the Jewish people, then the Palestinians are either villains or at best walk-ons. And that's an entirely false framing. This is a country that has a history before Zionism, which includes Jews and includes its relationship to Judaism and the Jewish people. But seen from the perspective, a comparative perspective, or from the perspective of the Palestinians, it has an entirely different aspect than this tragic conflict between two peoples and we know which one is right, or the Palestinians and the Arabs and the Muslims just have this inveterate hatred for Jews, and that's the only thing that motivates them. It's irrational, it's evil, and the only thing you can do is build an iron wall and protect these poor innocent people from unreasoning attacks from these fanatics who just hate them for reasons that are unfathomable. It's just anti-Semitism going back millennia. Both of these framings do enormous violence to what actually happened. And so what I do is I take a comparative perspective. I talk about what happens in Palestine starting at the end of the 19th century and picking up steam with the Balfour Declaration in 1917 as what it was, which was a process of settler colonial conquest of a country from its indigenous population. That is what is happening. That is what was happening. That is how early Zionists saw it. I mean, I quote Theodore Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism. I quote Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of the trend in Zionism, which has dominated Israeli politics since 1977. And to this day, Netanyahu's father was a secretary to Jabotinsky. Prime ministers like Sharon, like Olmert, like Shamir, like Begin were in the tradition of Jabotinsky. So I quote Herzl, I quote Jabotinsky, I quote other Zionist leaders as saying, yes, of course this is a colonial endeavor. Of course the Palestinians will resist. Of course we have to take this land from them. They make no bones about it privately, and one of them, Jabotinsky, made no bones about it publicly. He was the one who coined the term Iron Wall. He said that we're in a colonizing project. Of course they will resist us. Other Zionist leaders said this in privacy rather than publicly. And so I frame it as it should be framed, as a colonial settler project. Now, it is also a national project. Zionism it constitutes an attempt to create a national entity for the Jewish people, up to this point, a very successful attempt. And what I argue is, this is not so unusual. We ourselves, Americans, live in a successful settler colonial project. So do Australians, so do Canadians, so do New Zealanders. There are other such projects that were much less successful: Algeria, Kenya, South Africa. And there are others that fit in another category. And I draw on this because it has a lot of illustrative, I think, utility. The Irish case. I'm now working on a study, which I don't know when it will be done, about Ireland and Palestine as the first and last cases of British settler colonialism. They're very different in many, many respects. But the interesting thing is every one of these cases of settler colonialism, the successful ones and the unsuccessful ones, have some lessons that I think can be brought to the Palestine case. The difference is that in the case of Palestine, the Palestinians faced what became a successful national movement, a successful state. It's different, therefore, in a number of ways. So that's the second thing I wanted to say, that what I've tried to do is completely reframe this. This was a process of conquest of Palestine by a settler colonialism, which was not doing it on its own. I argue that the wars that were waged on Palestine were waged largely by great powers in support of this project, this colonial project. Great Britain takes up the first two chapters of the book. The United States and the Soviet Union then play a role. Without them, you would not have had the partition of Palestine. The Americans and the Soviets shoved it through the General Assembly, browbeating, blackmailing, arm twisting, bribing countries, more or less the way Pompeo and Trump are trying to blackmail and browbeat Sudan today to recognize Israel. The same kind of great power, gunboat diplomacy type stuff. And finally, in several of the other chapters, I show how the United States ended up taking on this role. So these are wars which are sanctified by international declarations, the League of Nations or the United Nations, which are dominated by great powers that are aligned with or supporting or utilizing or seeing the utility of Zionism and that colonial project, and later on of the State of Israel. So that's the way I framed the book. It's organized in terms of different phases of what I call this war on Palestine and the Palestinians. In each of these phases, what I try and do is not just analyze things. I try and describe them from the point of view of the people involved. So when I talk about World War I talk about what happened to my family, my grandparents, my uncles and aunts. My dad was born during World War I. A bunch of my uncles were conscripted into the Ottoman army. 4 of my uncles were conscripted into the Ottoman army during World War I. We're all miraculously fortunate to survive. I talk about these kinds of personal connections to these events in every chapter. Leading up to the last chapters where my own involvement and my own observations as either a witness or as a participant are central to the narrative. So I talk about the 1982 war when my wife was pregnant with Ismail, actually, as it happens, with Sam. And I talk about what happened to us, as well as what was happening and what the 1982 war, really, the invasion of Lebanon and the occupation of much of it, and the siege of Beirut and the expulsion of the PLO from Beirut, what actually happened and how to understand that, but also how it felt to some of us who were there. And so that's the structure of the book. That's the genesis of the book. That's what I think makes the book different from, I think, certainly most other histories. So it's an attempt to write a history, but it's an attempt to write a history from a personal perspective, from using family and other archives to personalize it. And I hope people will have a chance to read it and enjoy it. And I'd be happy to answer your questions, Peter, and then people in the audience.
So thank you, Rashid, for that very brief summation of a very substantial piece of work. I actually think you've accomplished more than just making the story accessible. Because as I follow your argument in the book, a central factor is the ways that time and time again, Palestinians are rendered invisible in the arguments about what should happen to Palestine, as if the land was empty. And your use of your family's stories and your family's experiences is a way of rendering visibility in a system that functioned by rendering people invisible. So I think you've done more than you're claiming that you've done, and I think it really works. And I think of the dominant representations that we see of Palestinians, and I think of the cosmopolitanism of your family that you show, people going abroad to study, people being imprisoned in the Seychelles and other parts of the British Empire, that this is not an isolated fragment of humanity at all. And I think you've done a marvelous job of demonstrating that. And so it's not only a readable book, but it really does undercut the dominant arguments that so many of us have been exposed to, and that's been that. I also wanted to say that when in the last month, this agreement was reached with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and brokered by the United States and sealed at the White House, I thought, oh my God, this is exactly what Rashid is predicting in the book. Identifying the problem of Arab states that are themselves not accountable to their own people, let alone to Palestinians, and the role that the United States has assumed really since the Reagan era of being a broker and rendering the Palestinians invisible so that they're not even mentioned in this treaty with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. So I wanted
They
to
are mentioned, but it's an afterthought.
as an afterthought. Yeah. Do you want to
As
say
in
it?
so many of the documents I cite in the book. I mean,
Right.
they're not mentioned in the Balfour Declaration. They're not
Right.
mentioned in Security Council Resolution 242, and they're barely mentioned, as you say, in these treaties.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to say a little bit about what crossed your mind when you heard the announcement of this treaty and
Right.
saw this charade at the White House?
Well, I think you're right. It bears out what I argue at the very end of the book, which is that this administration is going to try and bypass the Palestinians.
Mhm.
It's going to follow Netanyahu's strategy, which is the outside-in strategy, win over pliable Arab regimes where consent of the governed is not a factor.
Right.
These people rule over and against the wishes of their populations.
Mhm.
These are the most absolute monarchies on earth. These people make Louis XIV and Henry VIII look like, Democrats, liberals. They are the most reactionary regimes on earth. And those are the chosen partners of the Trump regime, and those are the chosen partners of the Netanyahu leadership of Israel. Governments that are not accountable to their people, that do not represent consent of the governed, where repression is fiercely, savagely repressed.
Mhm.
So I wasn't in the least surprised. I was irritated and depressed, of course, because then you get another narrative. The Arabs are tired of Palestine. Well, if the Arabs are a bunch of robed kleptocrats and bemedaled generals who rule at the expense of, while stealing the wealth of their people, the Arabs have recognized Israel. But those Arabs don't represent the Arabs. There are public opinion polls done all over the Arab world that show that the Arabs, i.e. the overwhelming majority, 80 to 90% of Arabs, don't want to normalize with Israel until Israel deals in a just fashion with the Palestinians. They're not against normalization or whatever. It's that until Israel stops stepping on the neck of the Palestinians, they see no reason to be nice to Israelis. Now that a bunch of people whose regimes entirely depend on external support against their own people and against their external enemies should cut a deal with Israel or with Trump is perfectly understandable. Some of these regimes were created with foreign support. The Saudi regime could not have been created without British support, could not survive without American support, could not have survived. And of course, they're dependent on Washington. And if Washington says, we want you to go to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, they do what they're told. Now, the Saudis aren't doing it right now because they have an aged leadership that understands that there is such a thing as public opinion in Saudi Arabia and public opinion in the Arab world. But there is a younger generation of leadership among these kleptocratic autocrats, represented by the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia and represented by the Crown Prince in Abu Dhabi, the Hamad bin Zayed in the United Arab Emirates, who don't care about public opinion. They have the prisons and the secret police and the trolls and the security assistance from the United States and Israel to master, control, and repress public opinion, they think. So no, I wasn't in the least surprised. one of the things that saddens me is that the Palestinian response to this has not been more vigorous and more forthcoming. You know, it's past time for the aged and discredited leaderships of the Palestinians to come together, which they now are finally doing years and years and years after they should have. It's past time for them to come up with a strategy. It's past time for them to come forward with a peace plan. It's past time for them to begin to actually carry out public diplomacy in the world, in Israel, in the Arab world, and in the world. They're not doing that. They have failed. They have failed their people utterly, and they should be removed because of those failures. And it's sad to see that, and that is another excuse for the Israelis and the Americans and the Gulf leaderships. I was on Australian radio yesterday, and the interviewer quoted something from the, I think, Emirati ambassador to Paris or somewhere, Paris, I guess it was. And he said something derogatory about the Palestinian leadership. And of course, it's an attempt to cover up for what the Emirates is doing to sell out the Palestinians. But there's some truth in these criticisms. And that's another point I should make about this book. I try and explain things in a way that shows the kind of very difficult situation the Palestinians were in, fighting a successful and vigorous colonial settler movement, which was at the same time a national movement that was operating in a global environment of the rise of fascism and Hitler, which energized it. And so they were up against enormous odds and fighting the greatest imperial power of modern history, the British Empire. But that they often made foolish or mistaken decisions, and that is one of the features of Palestinian history, leadership that hasn't always been up to the task. I don't talk entirely negatively about Palestinian history. I talk about resistance that in some cases was successful. The first Intifada. I talk about some of the things that the PLO did that were successful in making the Palestine cause more understandable throughout the world in the 60s and the 70s. I talk about the revolt of 1936-39 and its successes and its failures. So I think that, I try and give a nuanced picture of that. But I'm very harshly critical of Palestinian leadership at different times, while trying to give them their due at other times and explaining the incredibly difficult circumstances in which the Palestinians were forced to operate.
Right. I found the book ultimately to be hopeful. And it seemed to me that there were two areas that you were hopeful about as finishing the book. One being particularly the way you described the First Intifada, and not only in terms of its outcomes, which were limited, but the process and the energy and the kind of grassroots activism that it represented, a kind of breakthrough. And then secondly, the kind of changing public opinion here in the United States in particular. And I think, given the dreadful job that the American media does, it's remarkable that stories get through at all. And we go back to the theme of the invisibility of Palestinians and how important it is that Americans hear and see the actual stories, not just of horribly victimized people, but also, as I said, cosmopolitan people with ideas and culture and art and activism. So what we're even doing this morning, having this conversation, and I just looked and I see there are 140 people watching this on a Saturday morning. That's a pretty significant thing. And
there
you
are more
were
on
saying,
Facebook.
And more on Facebook. And you were saying, Rashid, about all the places that you've been talking about the book. So
Virtually,
right. I wonder if you would say a little bit about where you see hopefulness, both on the ground in Gaza and the occupied territories, and where you see hopefulness here in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, on the face of it, the situation inside Palestine is very discouraging. You have these aged leaderships with no vision who are more interested in preserving their own power than they are in furthering the Palestine cause. You have people depressed and demobilized to a very large extent by the situation and by the divisions among Palestinian in Palestinian politics. And you have a repressive apparatus that Israel has perfected over more than 70 years, which is operating, unfortunately, in coordination with some security elements of the Palestinian Authority to keep things as they are, to maintain the status quo, whereby colonization can go forward, whereby annexation, creeping annexation can continue, and the rug can be pulled out from under the Palestinians. So on the one hand, you have that situation. On the other hand, you have this vibrant civil society, which has launched the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which has carried out all kinds of initiatives in Gaza, in the West Bank. And you have inside Israel, among the 20% of the Israeli population who are Palestinian Arabs, a vibrant political leadership, which has managed to expand Arab participation in elections, expand the ability of Palestinians inside the Israeli system to be active, and which have managed to put together a joint list that has, produced real representation in the Israeli Knesset. So there are all kinds of elements that are encouraging inside Palestine at the same time as there are elements that are discouraging. Here, as you say, I think that there are all kinds of elements also that are encouraging. Yes, we have the Trump regime, which is a minority regime kept in place, the minority representing a minority of the American people, kept in place by our antiquated constitution, written by a bunch of rural slaveholding aristocrats who hated democracy. They were 18th century English aristocrats. English aristocrats were not Democrats. Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson, the people we worship, and this document we worship, is not a democratic document. It's a document intended to preserve the power of states, the power of rural areas, the power of elites, the power of slaveholders. This 230-year-old document serves today to guarantee that the people who lost the 2018 midterms by 10 million votes control the Supreme Court, control the presidency, and control the Senate. That can change. But that's the bad news. And those people are closely aligned with Israel. They have a lot of support in the country from about 30 or 40%, but they are a distinct minority, and the demography is against them. The future will change that, hopefully, unless they tear up the Constitution even more. But that's another issue. On the other hand, you have these enormously important demographic changes, and you have a rising knowledge and understanding of basic issues in American society like racism, of basic issues in American society like how Native Americans were treated, basic issues in American society of how immigrants are mistreated. And these are the views of the majority of Americans. There's no question but that most Americans understand something of these things. And they are fortunately not victims or subject to the corporate mass media. People have other ways of getting information, some of them bad, some of them good. You have things like QAnon, and you have things like Fox News, and you have things like Facebook groups that are dedicated to peddling fantasy and lies. But people do also have access. And I've seen this amongst my students. They don't read the New York Times or watch CNN. They have multiple sources of getting information. They're far smarter and far more knowledgeable than the generation I taught 20 years ago. So that has been the motor of a remarkable change. I mean, you look at polling of the people who identify as Democrats, the majority party, 10 million more votes than the Republicans in 2018. The majority party, 5 of the last 6 elections won by the Democrats. So this is the majority party. This is the party that represents the overwhelming majority of Americans. And if you look at those people, they are open-minded on Palestine. Majorities of them say, yes, we should sanction Israel for certain behaviors. Yes, we should be more fair-minded and balanced in our attitudes. Now, that hasn't affected the leadership of the Democratic Party. That hasn't affected much of the congressional delegations of the party in the Senate and the House. That certainly hasn't affected the presidential candidate, Senator Vice President Biden and Senator Harris are very committed to the status quo. So the Clintons, so were the Obamas, so are Senator Schumer and House Speaker Pelosi. The leadership of the party is firmly pro-Israel. The base of the party is not anymore. That's an enormously important change. an enormously important change. We never had dozens of Congress people and a few senators who were willing to say and do and sponsor measures the way people in the House and the Senate are today. That never happened in American history. And those people represent what majority sentiment of the Democratic Party, which is the majority party. So that's a change. Another change is what's happening in the Jewish community. Read the polls. Many people, many, especially younger people in the Jewish community, are questioning the stuff that they have been fed over generations through the media, through their synagogues, through Jewish day schools, through whatever means it may have been. The mass media played the major role actually there. And they're coming to understand that there is another narrative and there's a reality underneath this Potemkin village that's been created for them. The magical mystery tour that they go on when they're taken to Israel, in fact, shows them nothing of the reality. And more, especially younger people in the Jewish community and other communities, are awakening to that and are forming. We have a referendum ongoing today at Columbia. It started a couple of days ago, asking the university to divest. Barnard has already voted in favor. Brown already voted in favor. Barnard College of Columbia University a couple of years ago. You could not have had that in Ivy League schools or in any other schools in the United States 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Whether the referendum succeeds or fails, the very fact that a referendum was put to the student body of Columbia University in New York City. New York City has the largest Jewish population in the world. New York City is where the Zionist movement gathered its strength. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, the second president of Israel, spent 4 years in New York City during and after World War I doing organizing. Those were some of the most competent people to lead a 20th century political movement. They spent 4 years here building the foundation for the movement in the United States that supported the Zionist project and has supported the state of Israel generously with enormous amounts of funds. In New York City, at Columbia and at NYU and at City College and at Fordham and so forth, the children and the grandchildren of the people who built that powerful network of support for Israel are questioning. I mean, this is unprecedented in my experience. I mean, when I grew up, when I was a college student, the word Palestine was a dirty word. You couldn't talk about it. If you identified yourself in a certain way, you were looked at as if you were a bad person. I remember when Golda Meir came to Yale to speak and we demonstrated. There were 4 of us. I was a Sudanese graduate student. There was a Lebanese American friend of mine. There was a white guy, an American guy, and there was me. And there were maybe, 1,000 people wildly receiving Golda. And it was like 1,000 or 500 or however many there were to 4. That's not the situation on American college campuses today. It's just not like that anymore, which is not to say that the Palestinian narrative has won. It's just that the Palestinian narrative actually can be accessed, which it couldn't be before. And there's a massive effort to shut that down. Somebody at San Francisco State tried to bring Leila Khalid. Facebook, Zoom, and YouTube shut it down. They took it off. She was not able to speak. Legal action is taken against students. Administrative action is taken against faculty all over the country to prevent them from speaking on the spurious grounds that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, on the spurious ground of terrorism. I mean, all kinds of lying, deceitful constructions are being put forward by battalions of lawyers, by unscrupulous politicians, and by very powerful network of organizations that are dedicated to making sure that that narrative cannot be discussed, that nobody can talk who says anything that's critical of Israel or Zionism. And they're not succeeding. But there is a huge struggle on campuses and in public opinion. Obviously, we have a First Amendment, and sooner or later, those horrific limitations on freedom of speech will be struck down. But until that happens, there's a battle out there. The interesting thing is in academia, if you look at what's published today, you can have access to any number of elements of different narratives on Palestine, Israel. The kind of hagiography where Yitzhak Rabin is a saint to a critical biography well, here's a critical biography of Ben-Gurion by an Israeli author. From understanding of Palestine in settler colonial terms to all kinds of other understandings. there's an incredible range of literature in sociology, in anthropology, in political science, in history, in literature, which wasn't available 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Simply, that didn't exist. And you have novels, and you have plays. I mean, my son is a playwright, so I'm attuned to the theater world. But you have poetry, you have a whole range of forms of literature. I mean, I'm bombarded with books every few weeks, another novel, another collection of plays on Palestine, by Palestinians, about Israel and Palestine, that, you know, offer perspectives that were completely unavailable a generation ago, completely unavailable. So these are all signs of a cause for real optimism.
Great. Thank you, Rashid. I just want to end my part of the program by saying I'm so glad that your book is now part of this discourse and is available to both people outside of academia as well as inside. Again, as I'm emphasizing, to make Palestinians no longer invisible
Right.
in our understanding of the Middle East. I'm going to turn things over to Matt.
Let me say one last thing, Peter.
Sure.
Which has to do with what you just said about invisibility. Many years ago, Edward Said wrote about the fact that the Palestinians did not have what he called permission to narrate. You couldn't talk. You were not allowed to talk. You didn't exist. That has changed. You will still get situations where people say, well, we can't have you without a balancing perspective. You know, we can't talk about slavery without having slaveholders. We can't talk about the Nazis without having, we can't talk about the Holocaust without having a Nazi. You would never say that. But, you can't talk about Palestine without having an Israeli perspective. That kind of shutting out of the Palestinians is slowly but surely breaking down. And so increasingly, Palestinians do have the permission to narrate.
Great. Great. Maddie, you want to share some questions with Rashid?
Yes, we have very enthusiastic questions from the audience. So I don't suppose we'll have time for all of them, but we'll do our best here. So first of all,
maybe you can bundle if there are similar questions. Bundle.
Yes, we've been trying to do that a little bit.
Right.
So first of all, okay, thank you MAPN and Dr. Khalidi and ESFL for your presentation. As I understand, the entire conflict was evoked and caused by the British. Despite the decline in the British power and influence, why don't they put significant efforts in resolving the mess they created?
Yeah, I mean, as I argue in the book, the questioner is right. The British played a crucial role, an indispensable role in establishing the Zionist project until the Balfour Declaration in 1917. I describe Zionism as a colonial movement in search of a metropole, of a colonial mentor, of a power that would sponsor it. And they found that power in Great Britain. And Britain proceeded through the Balfour Declaration and through the terms of the mandate that it drafted for itself, the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. It proceeded to measurably further the Zionist project. I mean, political Zionism goes back to the 1870s, 1880s. It becomes a formal movement with the first Zionist Congress in 1897. But until the British come along and put this process on steroids, it was a project that had not found an external sponsor. And everybody understands settler colonialism cannot operate without the might of an empire behind it, without the might of a metropolitan power behind it. And that is what Zionism found in Britain. And I show how the British played the role of patron of this movement up to and until the 1936-39 revolt, where the British bring in 100,000 troops to crush a Palestinian uprising against their rule and against the Zionist project, without which the history would have been entirely different. Had that military force, the Royal Air Force, the blowing up of houses, summary executions, massive repression, not been exercised over 3 years, again, the course of history would have been entirely different. Why don't the British make up for that? Well, what colonial power has made up for its past sins? I mean, they haven't come to terms with slavery fully. They haven't come to terms with colonialism generally. I haven't seen the British apologizing for settler colonialism in Kenya. So there's a lot that the colonial powers, the French, the Belgians, the British, the Dutch, and the United States for that matter, have to atone for it, if I may use that term.
Thank you. Can you explain how you see the Palestine and 48 land participation in Israeli elections as hopeful? Given the messages that were stated in this joint list by Palestinians and Israelis that did not recognize the demand for a free Palestine and normalizes the existence of colonial Israel on the majority of Palestinian land?
Yeah, well, this is a critique of what I said. This question implies a critique of what I've said, which is that I think that it's very encouraging that Palestinians inside Israel have employed the mechanisms that the Israeli system allows them to organize and to put forward a unified position. There are many Palestinians inside Israel who refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the state under which they've lived for 3 generations, and that's a legitimate position, I suppose. I think it's a politically foolish position myself. I think that employing any lever that you have of power, as people in the joint list, that is to say, the people who've gotten themselves elected to the Israeli Knesset, as the leaders of the Arab municipalities, they have a council, they operate collectively to try and get more resources for their people, as they have done, I think is the right approach. Is Israel a settler colonial entity that has done violence to the Palestinians inside Israel? Of course, most of their land was taken away, stolen from them, even though they were citizens of the state. The state has 60 or 70 laws, grossly discriminatory, racist laws, which favor Jews and disfavor the 20% of the population who are Arabs. Israel is a state created for and intended to benefit the Jewish people worldwide at the expense of the indigenous population. And all of these things were then enshrined in a new law, the Jewish nation state law in 2018, which basically said there's one people with the right of self-determination in the land of Israel, and that's the Jewish people. There's no other people here. There's no other people who have rights here, national rights here. You're here on sufferance. Well, all of these things are monumentally objectionable, obviously. But I think that the question of how to deal with them is one that the Palestinian leaderships inside Israel, representing 20% of the Israeli population, have done relatively shrewdly. And so while accepting the arguments that, this is an entirely unjust, discriminatory system, I think that to describe it in terms of apartheid is to actually not fully comprehend exactly how comprehensive and discriminatory it is. It's worse in many ways than apartheid. Many South Africans have come to Palestine and said, this is much worse than what we had. And they're right. Nevertheless, I think that the approach taken by people in Palestine who have lived in Israel, know Hebrew, and understand the way the system works a hell of a lot better than the rest of us, those of us who live, as I do, outside of Palestine, or those Palestinians who live under occupation, whether in Gaza or the West Bank. They understand that system really, really well. There's nothing that the questioner would say that would surprise them. Maddie.
Yep, I'm here. Sorry. How would you compare the level of the Palestinian will to resist now as opposed to 10 years ago, 30 years ago, and even earlier?
That's a good question. If you study colonial settler projects, take Ireland, or take Kenya, or South Africa. People cannot maintain a movement and a level of mobilization, a permanently high level of mobilization over decades. And the questioner I think it's a really good question, because there are periods in Palestinian history, the 60s, for example, which witnessed an enormous peak in Palestinian involvement, Palestinian mobilization, new Palestinian thinking. There are other periods where things seem to be going backwards. The period immediately after 1948, after the Nakba, after more than a half of the Palestinian people were kicked out of their homes and lost their property, all their property, was one such period of what appeared to be a very low level of mobilization. It led ultimately to a revival of the Palestinian national movement in the late 50s and the 60s, but it didn't look like that for a decade or more, decade and a half. I think we're in a similar period. There was a much more extensive mobilization of Palestinians during, say, the first Intifada from 1987 to the early 1990s than there has been ever since. There were other periods of enthusiasm and other periods of mobilization in Palestinian history, the 30s, the 20s, and other periods of really a lack of mobilization. And so I think we're going through one of those low periods right now. I don't know. I'm a historian. I can't predict the future. I don't know what's going to happen. But the very persistence and resistance of the continued persistence and resistance of the Palestinians in the face of really quite heavy odds would lead me to guess that there's going to be another level of mobilization and another level of activism coming sooner or later. When, I don't know.
Thanks. So this is a specific question about the book. On pages 90, 114, and 176, you mention the circumstances and dates of the foundings of Fatah, Hamas, and the PLO. Will you comment, please, on their combined evolution and why the firstborn was found inadequate by the second and both deemed insufficient by the third?
The first, second, and third being Fatah,
Hamas, and the PLO.
Fatah, the PLO, and Hamas. Yeah, that's a big question that would require a very long answer. It's a good question. All three of those political entities are still in existence. I would argue that all three of them represent different phases of Palestinian nationalism. There's a wonderful article by a woman named Helga Baumgarten who teaches at Birzeit University. She was a colleague of mine at the American University of Beirut many years ago, called The Three Faces/Phases of Palestinian Nationalism. And she talks about Fatah, the PFLP, and Hamas. And she includes Fatah and the PLO and the PFLP in the same phases. And I think that the first and the second, that is to say, Fatah and other nationalist groups that were established in the 50s and 60s, and the PLO, which those groups took over in 1965, 64, 65, 66, and formally controlled from 68 onwards. They represent an earlier stage of Palestinian nationalism, building on what had happened in the 30s and the 40s and the 20s, but an entirely different stage. For one thing, the leadership in the 20s and the 30s was hampered by the fact that it was drawn largely from Palestinian urban elites, the upper classes, the notables, merchants, and so on. It was not a democratic leadership. It was not an inclusive leadership. It was a leadership that had been brought up under the Ottomans to believe that if they were successful intermediaries with the powers that be, they could get concessions. That worked maybe or maybe not with the Ottomans. It didn't work with the British. So that leadership and its approach failed. They were succeeded by people of a different social class, people who grew out of the dislocation and trauma of the Nakba. The people who founded Fatah and the PFLP, and later on Hamas, and who took over the PLO, were people from middle-class backgrounds. They were people, in many cases, who were refugees. They were people who operated in the diaspora because most Palestinians had been forced to leave their homes in 1948, and they have completely changed the nature of Palestinian politics. And however, they've created a new elite, and the people who dominate Palestinian politics today, whether they're from Fatah or they're from Hamas, I think have no vision for where to go. The approaches that they have tried, whether it's what Hamas calls resistance or whether it's the negotiating approach of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority dominated by Fatah, have both failed completely. They've shown that the Palestinians are still there. There are some things to be said for each of those approaches, but basically they don't offer a roadmap into the future. Both Fatah and Hamas are still tied to the two-state approach of establishing an independent Palestinian state on a small part of what used to be mandatory Palestine. A lot of people would question whether there's any viability to such an approach today in the 21st century, with what Israel has done over more than 50 years to make sure that a Palestinian state is impossible, and is doing with the support of the United States. And I argue in the book, the United States has long supported an approach which basically guaranteed the non-existence of a Palestinian state. This was not just an Israeli effort, this was an Israeli-American effort. And I think all of these leaderships have failed to take that into account and to think about a different and more innovative way to strategize for the Palestinian people.
Thank you. So we're approaching 11, so I have one more question and then we'll go to wrap up. I have your book and appreciate the personal aspect. This person is still early on in reading. To what extent do you include the impacts of events in the lower echelons of Palestinian society? This is not a criticism. I'm sure you do include them. Would just like to hear a few details or examples.
Right. Well, I touched on this just now in the answer I just finished, which is that in the first part of the book, we are talking about a Palestinian national movement that is led by members of the elite, by families like my own. I mean, my uncle was one of the leaders. And so my critique of them and of their inability to launch a mass-based political movement is a critique of the entire elite. That has changed. I talk, however, in the book, and the perspective that I take is a perspective, this is not a comprehensive history of Palestine. There's a lot of social history and a lot of economic history that's not in this book about grassroots activism. But one of the things I show is that in the 36-39 revolt, in the Intifada, it was not the leaderships that were responsible for the successes. The first Intifada and the 36-39 revolt were grassroots, popular undertakings, which took the leadership entirely by surprise. The Arab Higher Committee that was formed in 1936 of the traditional leaders were taken entirely by surprise. The Mufti, the various other leaders. The same thing was true of the PLO in 1987 when the first Intifada erupted. They did not organize it. They did not lead it. They were taken by surprise by it, and it was a movement from below. So this book is not history from below, and especially the first parts, where I'm leaning on the memoirs of my uncle and other materials about people who were involved in that leadership. Do talk about it, the elite, but as you'll see, as the history goes on and as the book goes on, that changes. The people who are leading this movement and the people who are responsible for the most important events tend to be people from other social classes and involve mass involvement in grassroots politics.
Thank you so much. So I apologize for everyone who asked questions that we weren't able to get to at this time. Thank you for your enthusiasm and interest, for sure. I'm going to turn it back over to Janet to do some wrap up, and we will talk about where you can find this book if you are local and if you prefer to shop online. And I do have a related question about that. Is this book available in Arabic, and where would one purchase that?
There is an Arabic translation underway. It's going to take a little while for it to come out, however. So yes, there is a publisher in Beirut who we have a contract with and who has provided with a translation. Unfortunately, I'm juggling many balls in the air, and to go over this translation as carefully as I have to do, it's going to take me a little bit of time. So until I do that, it's not going to come out. But yes, there is an Arabic translation in the works. There are also editions all over the world. I mean, there's a German edition, there's a Korean edition, there's a Chinese edition. Hachette has brought out an edition in English for India. So it's available in many different parts of the world. Well, thank you for putting up the names of all of those bookstores. Support your local bookstores. We really need them.
I agree. Janet, are you here?
I hear her.
Do you have closing notes, Janet?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
And can you see me?
Yep.
Yep, we're good.
Not that that's important, but thank you, Dr. Khalidi. We could go on and on, I'm sure. And this is just a foretaste of things to come for those of you who have not read the book. Having read the book, I echo everything Peter said about its accessibility and ability to transcend the academic into the heart. There's a lot of heart in this book as well, and I think that can't be ignored. I want to also state some thank yous. I know that there were some thank yous done earlier, but I would like to also, certainly to you, Dr. Khalidi, for having written the book and for sharing it with us this morning. Thank you to Peter and the Eastside Freedom Library for your decision to co-host this event with us and also to help to moderate the conversation. I would like to thank our co-sponsors. We board members sought many organizations throughout the Twin City area and a bit beyond to co-sponsor this event to get the word out. And Maddie will post that list of co-sponsors anon. I want to thank Madeline and Maya for our Zoom technical issues and just making sure that the Zoom event moves along smoothly. I really appreciate that, Maddie. You can't know how much. And certainly I would like to thank once again Mary Bader, as Peter did and Rashid did as well. Mary and her husband Joel attended an earlier event at Eastside Freedom Library with Dr. Khalidi, and that's how they found out about this, purchased the book and said, we've got to get him as our forum system. And we are grateful to both of you for introducing that idea and for following through. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of you for sitting in on this Zoom forum session. If you like what you saw, if you are not a member of Middle East Peace Now and would like to be placed on our mailing list, please email us at mepn@mepn.org and just indicate that you would like to be placed on our mailing list. We use MailChimp to get out the word about our monthly forums. Our speakers generally address issues of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and a little bit beyond that issue as well. There was a question in the chat to post more information about the Eastside Freedom Library. I presume that will be done as well. This concludes our portion of the session. I want to thank everybody for attending and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to say one more thing to note that if people are interested, we have a forum next month on the 17th, and we will be having Christian Davis Bailey speaking on what is needed for Palestine and Black liberation in late 2020. And Christian Bailey is a writer and organizer based in Chicago, and his work focused on the intersections between the Black and Palestinian struggles and Black internationalism. He's co-founder for Black for Palestine and co-author of the 2015 Black Solidarity with Palestine statement signed over by 1,000 Black activists, including Angela Davis, Cornel West, Momia Abu Jabal, and he was a member of Students for Justice in Palestine, currently works for Palestine Legal. Just wanted to make sure to put that in. If people are interested, register and continue to come to our forums. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Rashid Khalidi.
Thank you all.
Absolutely.
Stay well,
Thank you.
Rashid. Thank you.
Take care, Peter.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Maddie. Thanks, Maya. Thank you very much, Shannon. And thanks to everybody who tuned in.
And if anyone has additional questions, not so much for the speaker, Dr. Khalidi, but for MEPN and ESFL, you can email our respective organizations. For example, if you have questions on future programming, etc. So that's how you can stay in touch with us.
Bye all.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.